read about something or see it on TV or watch it in a movie and you think you have an idea what the thing is really like, but when you get up close and personal to it, it's much bigger or more grand than you would have ever imagined? Anybody been to a place that was just much bigger than they thought? Where?
Grand Canyon.
The Grand Canyon. Where else?
Cathedral in Barcelona.
The Cathedral in Barcelona. Just huge, massive. Anywhere else?
Village City.
Where?
Village City.
Really? It was. How big was it? Pretty big. It sounds great. That's kind of how I measure things too. Shauna's like, how much money do we have in the bank account? I'm like, I don't know, a little bit. I have no idea exactly what's in there. So the last few days, my family, along with another family and a couple, our family went to Lake Tahoe for the very first time. You guys have been holding out on me. No one else has invited me. And so 18 months in, our first trip to Lake Tahoe, it was just amazing. On Friday, we decided that and I'd seen pictures, your pictures. I mean, you tell me about your trip. Don't invite me on the next one, whatever. I've seen pictures and I've seen things on the news and I've seen the map, and I'm just not real good with the scale, I guess. And so I saw that, okay, it kind of bleeds into 2 different states. But on Friday afternoon, we drove around the entire lake. And we had time for like all 3 meals of the day. The lake was that big. It was just huge. It blew my mind how big Lake Tahoe actually is. But some things are like that. When we get up close and personal to some things, regardless of what we had in our mind before, the size and the scope and the grandness of some of those things just blow our minds. As we enter into part 2 of the Storyteller series, the disciples have a moment with Jesus just like this. They had some ideas about who he was. They wanted to follow him. They liked the life that he presented and offered to them. But they have an experience that we're going to look at this morning. And it's one of those things that just blows their minds. Just how grand and big and the size and scope of who he is, what he represents, and what it means for them. It just absolutely blows their minds. So my hope for us this morning is that as we hear this story and think of our own story, that sort of we would get a little bit closer to who he is. And we just go, wow, I had no idea just how grand he is. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 4. If you have a Bible, if you need one, raise your hand. We'll distribute one to you. Just keep your hand up high. Free Bible for you. Don't say we never gave you anything, all right? Free Bible for you. If you've got one of those blue and white Bibles, either from before or you're getting one this morning, we'll be in Mark chapter 4, which is on page 545 in that gift Bible. 545, Mark chapter 4. Again, they have this encounter. They've known Jesus. Jesus has now for a while asked them to come follow him. They've been around him. He's been teaching them. They've heard him preach. They've heard him be accused of crazy things, which we'll talk about in a moment. But now they're going to encounter him in a way that they didn't think possible. My hope for us this morning is that we might encounter him in a way that we don't think possible as we come into the scene this morning. Would you stand as we sort of honor God's word and ask him to just help us. Help us see up close and personal. And then I think if we see him as he is in this passage, it can only increase our faith. So it says, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with him into the boat, just as he was. Just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose. And the waves were breaking into the boat, so much so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Isn't that crazy? There's this hurricane-like windstorm, and Jesus is in the stern, asleep on the cushion. They woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear. Wouldn't you be? Wouldn't you be filled with great fear? And they were filled with great fear. And said to one another, here's their storytelling beginning. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? You may be seated. Pray that God will bless the reading and the teaching of his word. So you have this crazy encounter. Here's the very first thing we read was on that day. Here's what happens in that day. Anybody have a stressful day this week? Anyone? Anybody have a stressful week? Like every day was stressful? All right, here's the day that Jesus has had so far. He's been accused of being demon-possessed. That's always one you want when you're God, right? That makes sense. He's been accused of being demon-possessed. His mom and his siblings come out and basically try to get him to come back home. Like, hey, you don't really need this sort of spotlight. And then he spends all day sort of teaching and preaching parables and even explaining the purpose of a parable itself. And so he's doing all of these things. That's the day that he's had. And so he says to his disciples, though everyone's listening, you can imagine him standing in a boat and teaching many, many people, the crowds. And then he says, hey, let's go to the other side. And the text says that the disciples took him with them in the boat just as he was. Meaning he didn't go get his duffel bag. He didn't go get his jacket, his outer cloak. He was just, that's how exhausted he is. Our kids, like last night was one of those nights. We tend to make our kids brush their teeth every night. But parents, there are those nights where you get back so late from an event, you don't care. Or they're so tired, you're like, like you think about what will the dentist say to me, but then you're like, I still don't care, right? And so last night was one of those nights for our kids. We gave them teeth brushing options. Because it was one of those things, they were so exhausted, it didn't really matter. They didn't have to go through their routine. So part of what they're telling us, I think Mark's telling us in his story in verse 36, he's saying, and they took Jesus in the boat with them just as he was. Meaning he didn't prepare for the trip. He didn't go get his jacket. You can imagine it's usually cool on the sea at night. He didn't go do any of those things. And that's one indication. And the other indication that he was exhausted, we'll see clearly in the text, right, when he takes a nap. Anybody take a nap every Sunday afternoon? Any Sunday afternoon nap takers? We're not going to think you're soft. Just raise your hand. Come on. Be honest. Do you guys ever take naps? You're like, no, I'm so busy. Listen, we all are in that world, all right? We all got stuff. But hey, so some of you, I know, I've heard that religiously from some of, maybe it's just our staff that likes to take naps on Sunday afternoon. But I know some people in the room are nap takers. So Jesus is exhausted. He just gets his stuff, like just what he has. He hops in the boat. And then you'll see later on how we can obviously show that he's exhausted. Verse 37 says, a great windstorm arose. Now, I'm speaking in a calm manner this morning. But if you're in that moment, there's nothing calm about a hurricane-like windstorm, right? Especially, it's one thing when you're in a house, it's scary. You're boarding the windows up. But if you're in the boat, if you're exposed to the elements in nature, this is a panic, a reason to panic kind of moment. Yes? And so we would all be doing the same thing. So it says a great windstorm arose, and it doesn't say the waves began to beat against the boat. It literally says that the waves began filling the boat. So the peril of them, the future for the disciples is pretty obvious, right? I mean, what would you do in that moment? Freak out, yes. What else? Pray, like say your last prayer. What else would you guys do in that moment? Do what? Wake up Jesus. That's a great thought. In fact, the disciples are on the same page with you. And so it says, now here's what's awesome. I love the text. And Mark uses when you're a storyteller, you want to be real clear with each word you use, each adjective. You want to make sure it gets a clear point across. And that's what all four of the gospel writers do. In fact, you'll see Matthew and Luke will tell a little bit different version of this story in their Gospels because they see it from a different angle and they remember a few different things that Mark doesn't pick up on and vice versa. And so that's what happens. So Mark says he gives us 37 first rather than saying Jesus is asleep because he wants his hearers to understand there's this huge thing going on. And then when he gives that what we translate in English, the word but there in verse 38, what he's saying is that this crazy storm that's a hurricane-like is blowing on the Sea of Galilee that day. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Here's one of the things that tells us about Jesus as we get up close to him. When you and I freak out, he doesn't. When you and I freak out in desperation, he doesn't. There's never a day in heaven where God sees our situation that drives us crazy. Right? And some things should drive us crazy. I get that. But there's never a day in heaven where God goes, what am I going to do? There's never a day where he goes, somebody help me. Somebody make sense of this issue. There's never a day where he's caught off guard so much that he goes, how? So everyone else, and that's a proper response, freaking out. I think it's proper in this situation. Jesus is sleeping. He's exhausted because his family issues always can exhaust you, right? His mom's begging him to come home. He's been accused of being demon-possessed. He's preached his heart out. He's physically exhausted, spiritually exhausted. He's asleep on the cushion. And as I understand it in my study this week, basically there was just sort of one cushion. It wasn't really for Jesus per se. It was mostly for the people that would be steering the boat and driving and things like that. And so Jesus is asleep in the stern, and he's on a cushion. And can you imagine the conversation the disciples would have with each other? In that moment, right, you got to go, which one of us is going to wake this guy up? Who do you think woke him up? And I don't know. Knowing some of the disciples, knowing some of their stories, it had to be Peter, right? But I can imagine like the drawing straws, and then Peter gets kind of big-chested, and he's like, I got this, right? So whoever it was, one of them goes and they wake Jesus up. And it's a proper response, right, to wake him up. But what is not proper in their response is what they said to him. I want you to put yourself in the body of Jesus and the heart and mind of Jesus. And I want you to hear what they're saying to him. Imagine you're Jesus, so you've left heaven, you've come to earth, you've come to really give up your divinity in a sense while you're on earth so that you might pay a great sacrifice for a lot of people, but for these 12 men especially, in a really personal way. So imagine you're Jesus, and there's a storm going on. You're alerted to the fact, and the very first thing they say is not help, is it? The very first thing they say to him when they wake him up, even though you can imagine they're really impassioned, they're emotional, they're in hysterics, they're freaking out, they're deciding, what are we going to do? What's happening? The first thing they say to him is an accusatory question, and it's this: Teacher, don't you care that we're dying? Because of the storm they were encountering, it led them to make conclusions about Jesus. Sometimes because you and I go through storms in our life, it leads us to make incorrect conclusions about Jesus. They assume because they're in a storm that he doesn't care. They're assumed because he's let them be in the storm that they don't matter as much as they thought they did before. And so, listen, Jesus isn't upset. You're going to hear Jesus ask them sort of some rebuking questions later, right? Jesus, is he upset because they woke him up? Why is he upset? Because they say to him, imagine you've come to earth to give your life to these men, a whole lot of other people, but to these 12 really in a first-hand sort of experiential way. So he's come to give his life for these people, and the very first thing they say to him, and they wake him up, is, don't you care? Do we matter? It's almost like they're saying, you pretend like you love us. Now we're in a windstorm. So they ask Jesus the question, don't you care? Does Jesus respond to them first? Or does he speak to someone else first? Or something else first? He doesn't answer their question initially, does he? Oh, he's going to get to them. So they ask Jesus a question about his compassion and love and care. Jesus says something to the wind and the sea. They're like, don't you care? Jesus is like, psh. And if you read the text here, make sure you understand this. It's when it says that what does it say? He rebuked the wind. However he did that, it doesn't say in Mark's account. He rebuked the wind, and then he said to the sea, peace, be still. And then the text reads, I think it's, verse 39, I think. 39 says, and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. So I want you to understand this. When I used to read this, I used to think that Jesus stopped the wind, but he didn't just stop the wind. He stopped the effects of the wind. So when it says there was a great calm, he's saying that he quieted the wind, but then the sea was instantly perhaps as calm as it had been in a long time, or that day at least. So he's not just saying to the wind and stop. He literally is saying to the waves, listen to this, and then scientists, it may be difficult for you to stay with me. He says to the wind, stop. But he also essentially says to the waves, hey, I know what you normally do long after the wind stops blowing. You stop that too. You stop. And the wind ceased, and there was this great calm. There was this just great calm on the sea. And then it says, and then it's time for him to not respond to the wind and the waves. It's time for him to respond to them. He asked him two questions. I think they're good questions for us this morning. The first question is this: why are you so afraid? Well, it seems obvious why they're afraid, right? Am I the only one that would be afraid in that moment? All of you super spiritual people. Why does Jesus ask the question? Why are you so afraid? Jesus is sort of obvious. We're about to die. Now, what you have to understand about many of these disciples is that they had spent hours and hours and hours on this sea. These are not like people, like if you take me sailing and a 10-mile-an-hour wind gets us, I'm going to be like, what was that? Right? They're not out to sea for the first time. This is not the first storm they've been in, which lets us understand sort of the magnitude of the storm that's coming into their midst. And Jesus says to him, why were you so afraid? And then he says to him, have you still no faith? Jesus wasn't upset that they woke him up. The question is, and I don't have an answer for it, the question is, what did they think Jesus could do? What did they think? Maybe they thought, well, man, maybe if he doesn't want to save us, maybe he'll save himself and we'll just be benefactors of that. What did they think Jesus could do? They didn't think he could do what he did. Anybody have a thought what they thought Jesus could do? I have no idea. The text doesn't tell us. It only tells us what they didn't think he could do. But they wake up, it's kind of like if you're going to die, you might as well get the other person to be conscious with you. Right? It's like, hey, if I'm going to do this, I mean, we might as well let him know what's coming his way. They wake him up. But when they wake him up, they tell him, don't you care? And then he comes to them and he doesn't talk about caring for them, does he? It's interesting. I want you to hear this so we can connect in a personal way. They say to him, don't you care? He tells the wind and waves to stop. But he doesn't answer his care for them. Because he's already shown his care for them, right? And he doesn't stop the wind and the waves simply because they asked him to do something. He wasn't proving himself to them, I don't think. He was proving something to them, but I don't think he was like, you don't think I care? Let me show you. And then he says to them, have you still no faith? Now, they at least had a little bit of faith to wake him up, right? Or maybe that wasn't faith. Maybe that was just the fear taking over. He says to them, have you still no faith? Because what he's getting at is, hey, you've seen me work miracles already. You've seen me speak in a way that no one's ever spoken to you before. And what they don't understand is that he is revealing a big picture of himself. What do they address him as? What title do they give him when they asked him the question earlier? Yeah, teacher. It's not Lord. It's not God. That's okay. He is a teacher. He's about to expand their view. He's about to expand the horizon. He's about to help them reveal. He's going to reveal and help them see that they have literally no idea who this man is that they're with. In fact, when you get to 41, after he says, why are you afraid? What does it say they're filled with? After he's just asked them, why are you afraid? It says they're filled with great fear. The text perhaps maybe saying is, if they were more afraid of what Jesus could do to the wind than they were of the wind themselves. Have you ever been in that moment where like someone, like maybe a friend, you know something about them, but then they start revealing something like, hey, I'm an MMA fighter, or hey, I won an Olympic medal, or hey, I do this, and you're just like, who am I with here? This is what's happening. They think they have an idea, a clue about who Jesus is. They see him as their rabbi, as their teacher, and they're going to leave this experience telling a very different story than they told before they got into the boat. And what my hope is that you and I would see him so up close and personal, and something would be newly revealed to us this morning, that we would leave this room, leave this experience going, whoa, there's a little bit more to him than I thought. So maybe he wasn't just a good teacher. So maybe he wasn't just a good moral man with a life of example that we should follow. Maybe there's more to this guy. Maybe there's more to this guy than this. There are really two questions that he's answering for them. He is answering the do we matter question, and he wants to answer that for us this morning. Because whether you're a young child in the room, whether you're a pastor, whether you have done the Jesus thing for a while, or you don't even believe in it at all right now, or somewhere all along the way, every one of us in this room wants to know at the end of the day, do we matter? Do we matter? And no, you're not the only person asking that question deep down. We all want to know, do we matter? Is there someone that really loves us? And if you think that you do matter, many of us believe that we matter because of what we bring to the table, right? We matter because we're smart. We matter because we're spiritual. We matter because we go to church. We matter because we help the old lady cross the street. We matter because we give to the homeless. We matter because we're good parents. But Jesus is wanting to answer the question in a different way. He wants to say, hey, yeah, you matter, but you don't matter because of what you bring to the table. Because when you had nothing to bring to the table, I invited you. When you had nothing to bring to the table, I overcame for you. When you couldn't get there yourself, I came to you. And that's what he's going to answer throughout his life. Listen to the question again they ask him. They say to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Now, think about, again, put yourself in Jesus' shoes. You came to earth to die for these men and many other men and women and children. And they're asking him, don't you care that we're dying? And in Jesus' mind, he must have thought this: not only do I care that you're dying, I'm going to die so that you don't have to spiritually. Think about the great paradox here. Jesus is going, they're going to him, hey, don't you care that we are about to die? This thing is about over. You're about to have to pick 12 new disciples if you make it out of here because we're done. They say, don't you care that we're perishing? And Jesus had to be thinking, oh, do I care? Do I care that you think you're dying? I care so much that I'm going to die in your stead. Do I care? And Jesus would spend the rest of his life, and he certainly would spend his death and resurrection answering this question over and over and over again. Some of us find ourselves in the middle of storms, financial storms, relational storms, right? Employment storms. Anybody facing a storm right now? Anybody? Just me? Yeah, we find ourselves in these storms. And we're led to usually one of two conclusions if we don't believe him for what he is and what he offers to us. One of two things. We either think that it doesn't matter to him, or we think that he can't do anything about it, or both. Last week I said to you, as we talked about the man who was born blind, and they said, has this man sinned or has his parents sinned? And Jesus said, no, the reason that he was born this way is so that the works of God might be displayed in his life. And I said to you that God is going to create space in our lives for his work to be displayed. This morning I want to say to you, God is also going to create space in our life for our faith to be displayed. Do you think you can grow your faith in times of joy and happiness? It's hard for faith to grow then, right? I don't have to have faith during those seasons. I really don't. Maybe faith that they'll continue. But it doesn't take great faith to get me through the great times. But God's going to put every one of us in storms that may initially make us go, do you care? Like, do you see me? Do you know what's going on here? And what God's going to do, just like he did for the disciples here, he's going to create space in our life for faith. Now, the reality that we all know in this room is that you can fill it with doubt or faith. But there's going to be space in every one of our lives. There's going to be something taken from you, and you're going to have to believe God for it when you can't give it to yourself. Something's going to happen relationally, and you can't control the way the other person responds, and you're going to have to place faith in God that he's going to bring peace in the end, either by restoring a relationship or by giving you peace to exit the relationship. Right now, every one of us in this room, there's space. Some of you are welcoming your first child soon. It's going to take a little bit of faith to believe that you've got the goods to be a good dad or mom. Right? Some of you are unemployed, and I've talked to you this morning. And you're like, I wish this thing would end. Do you think the disciples cared about an object lesson in the boat? Seriously, do you think they're like, brilliant, tell us what this is about? They cared about one thing. What was it? They just wanted it to be over. And the same thing happens to us when we find ourselves in the midst of a storm. We just want it to end. But listen, if it ends and you haven't struggled through the faith issues, then your faith hasn't grown. And I'm not saying this morning that if you have faith, it automatically ends. We kind of talked about that last week. All they want it to do is end. All we want it to do is be over. Right? Like there's the issue for Shauna and I right now, and we just want it to be reconciled. And I had to say to her, and she said to me yesterday, hey, we may have to do this 8 or 18 more times. Maybe a lot more than that. I don't know where the space God is giving you. Most of us aren't thankful for it. But God uses this space, this big gap in their faith, to teach them something. And it says there, listen to the conversation at the end, and we can only imagine how the story would go from here. It says they were filled with great fear and said to one another, like you can imagine, like Jesus has sort of just turned his back in my mind, like the story, he's just like, So imagine Jesus right here, right? Little boat action. And they're talking amongst themselves. They're like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? Isn't it amazing that they were more afraid, the text says, of who he might be than they were of the storm itself? They were filled with great fear. The storm's not raging anymore, is it? They're filled with great fear because they're like, who is this man? This morning, I was getting ready, and Asher, who will be 4 next month, my youngest son, he said to me, Dad, can I go to church with you early? I said, no, Dad needs to go up there and take care of some things to be ready for the service. And I said, are you going to be a preacher one day? Like, you going to be your thing? And he said, I don't know. You have to teach me. I said, all right. I said, if you could, I said, what would you say? What would be the things you would talk about? And he said 2 things, and it's funny. They're actually the points of this message. He said, I would tell them Jesus is God, and I would tell them that he loves them. The point of the story is that. Do we matter? And can God do anything about our plot in life? When most of us think about the word authority, is it a positive word for us or a negative word? Come on, be honest. Unless you're the boss, it's negative, right? It's negative until we get the authority, true? Like, we hate that position until we get the position, right? Authority is a negative word. Like, when you think about your parents exercising authority just because they can or just because I said so, that's not positive. When you think about people in authority or you think about our government, everybody's positive on that one, right? Stop. We don't do politics here. I forget. Government's awesome. We don't, and I don't see authority usually in a great light. But what if the person that had all authority, because part of the deal we don't see in a good light, authority is because we don't believe that most people in authority have our best interests at heart, do we? Most of us don't believe that our bosses wake up thinking about how can they love on us today, do they? Anybody got a boss like that? It's awesome when your staff keeps their hand down when you ask that question. That is awesome. Don't get into that. Most of our bosses don't. And people we think about in authority, we don't think about when the government makes a decision that they really have our personal best interests at heart, do we? But what if the one who claims to have all authority and displays that he has all authority, what if he's the one that actually is good? And what if he's compassionate? And what if he's loving? And what if he says he has good plans to prosper you? And what if he says that he works all things together for your good? Wouldn't you want that kind of person to have all authority? That's what Jesus is displaying, that you matter to me. And that no matter what comes up against you, I am greater than that. And he's not doing it, he's not on an arrogance trip. He's revealing exactly what Asher said the number one thing is he would say. That Jesus is God. And the stories the disciples must have told themselves and their family when they got back from this trip. Like, listen, we thought he was a great teacher. But when he told the wind to shut up, and it did. When he told the waves to stop moving, and they did. Okay, maybe he's not just a teacher. And other people all throughout Jesus' life would say things like this. He speaks unlike anyone else we've ever heard. When Jesus rose from the dead, he gave us what we call the Great Commission. And in that, he's going to say, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. But before he says anything of that nature, you know what he says? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That means your life is under his authority, even if you're not a follower of his. It means your storm is under his authority, even if you wish he wouldn't have allowed it. It means your relationships are under his authority. It means the fact if you wake up and have breath tomorrow morning, and I hope we all do, that's what it will take to get through tomorrow. It's under his authority. He's saying you matter. And when they ask the question, don't you care that we're dying? He says, oh yeah, I care, and I care so much. I'm going to the cross for you. I'm actually going to die in your place so that you won't, in a spiritual sense, have to experience that kind of death, that sort of separation from God. Friends, that's good news. And as you've seen him a little more up close and personal this morning, my hope and my prayer is that you will go and you will realize it's a bigger story you've been invited into than you could have ever imagined. He has all authority, and we matter to him. It's pretty significant. Let's pray. As I encourage every week, I do want to encourage again for you to consider placing your faith in a God who is, as we've said, he is this morning. The Bible says that everything really submits to his power and authority. And that nothing happens without him being aware of it. And to know that when you and I are freaking out with our issues in life, that he's not. He's not freaking out, and at the same time, he's not aloof. He's not distant. He cares about you. So when we say, Jesus, don't you care that we're falling down in this storm? He's going, yeah, I care. Because he did something about our biggest storm. Certainly he cares about the smallest ones too. I want to encourage you to place faith in him this morning. And you can do that. You can mark that on your card. You can just talk to one of the staff or a leader at our church. God, I thank you. God, I thank you that we matter. And God, I realize we're not the center of the story, but God, I'm thankful that we matter. And God, I'm thankful that we matter to a God who has all authority. And we matter to a God who can do something about our circumstances. And even if the God we know doesn't do something about our circumstances, he can do something in us. God, for every person in this room, either currently or really soon, there's going to be space for faith to exist or doubt to exist. God, we're going to walk through storms. Let us do that together, but God, let us do that with you. God, would you use these times to build our faith, to build our trust. And Jesus, as we've been up close and personal with you this morning, we see that there's more to you than morality, being a good moral person. We see that there's more to you than you just being a good teacher or a good man. You made a great claim on the water that day. May you make a great claim in our lives this morning that you are God, and that changes everything for us. May that be so in Jesus' name. Amen.